We are delighted to welcome back to Yale Minister Gareth Evans. He has covered the waterfront of Australian politics, starting off as a student leader. He became the first cabinet minister in 1983 as the Attorney General. Then he occupied several ministerial positions, and the last ministerial position he held was Minister of External Affairs, which he concluded in 1996. And since then, he has done many things, but most importantly, he has been the chairman and CEO of International Crisis Group, the famous non-governmental organization today, which covers the more than 60 countries and prevents the world, warns the world about coming crisis. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you back to Yale, Minister Evans.
Delighted to be back here, Nayan.
So you have just published a book which is has a rather unlikely title from a grizzled diplomat and public official like you. And indeed, the book does show that you are an incorrigible optimist. Without that optimism, you couldn't have carried on this long public career that you have had. So maybe you can start off by saying what is the origin of this optimism?
Well, of course, always looking on the bright side does lend itself to parody, as fans of Monty Python won't need any reminding. But I have been an optimist essentially for a combination of objective and subjective reasons. The objective reasons are that when you look at the great sweep of history, we really can see the positives as being the dominant story. The dramatic decline in the number of people in poverty. I mean, 700 million alone in the last 2 decades in China. We can see a dramatic decline in the incidence of violence, both across countries, within countries, domestically. Yes, there are some terrible spikes and terrible bumps, and we're seeing them, of course, now in Syria and Yemen, and we're seeing the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. And of course, if you're consumed by the daily headlines, it's very difficult to be optimistic about anything. But if you do look at that sweep of history, you see the decline. Steven Pinker at Harvard has talked about this. Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times writes about this every year, that this was really the best year in human history. Whatever else seems to have gone wrong simply because of the number of people no longer immiserized by grinding poverty. So there's that objective story, and the fact that of the individual things that are going wrong, no doubt some of which we'll talk about in North Korea and elsewhere, I do think there are solutions that are achievable with the right combination of goodwill. But the psychological reason is in many ways the more important one. I really do believe that if you want to make the world a better place, you've got to believe that that's possible. If you don't believe that anything you do is going to make much of a difference, if you are a congenital pessimist, you just don't get out of bed in the morning when it comes to working on these big public policy issues. So I think that both pessimism and optimism are self-reinforcing. They're not self-fulfilling, but they're self-reinforcing. And I believe, as I say in the book, quoting someone at the beginning, better to live your life as an optimist and be periodically proved quite wrong than to live your life as a pessimist and always be right.
But you are, in some ways, your optimism is surprising, given some of the very shocking episodes you have witnessed in your life, including your moving story of your Aboriginal friend, young person who commits suicide. And so, you have been a champion of racial equality and human rights. And so, would you ascribe these experiences to that desire for you to?
Yeah, well, it's why you are as you are is a combination, I think, of your innate instincts, your genetic makeup, but also your life experiences. And I've had many, many kinds of experience, both good and bad, but and the wake-up calls that come when you experience the psychological debilitation of Australia's Aboriginal people, of a kind which led my young friend to commit suicide in horrible circumstances. That's a wake-up call when it comes to any kind of complacency about the policy issues involved. Why am I at all optimistic about the condition of Indigenous Australians when so much is still not going right? Well, because we have made the apology to the stolen generation people in very moving and graphic terms. Australian governments successively now have taken responsibility and apologised for taking away youngsters from their families, for perhaps the best of motivations at the time, but with the worst of consequences. I am optimistic about the effect of recognising, as we now do in Australia, prior Indigenous ownership of the land, which for many decades was just a matter of denial for white Australians, white Australian governments. So Aboriginal land rights, Indigenous land rights are very much part now of the tapestry and a very dignifying dimension of the Aboriginal experience. So everywhere you look, there's the things that have gone horribly bad, the things that move you and impact you, but then you get out and try and do something about them, or work with governments that do, or with the international community, and I do see enough progress in enough places to make me continuingly optimistic, even though obviously elevation of someone like Donald Trump is a bit of a wake-up call for all of us, and a challenge to all of us. But for all of that, I think it's important to just keep looking at how you move the game forward rather than thinking about the inevitability of lack of progress.
We'll come back to that, but just I wanted to tell our audience about 2 episodes you describe in your book. As a sort of young student, not many politicians I know who have reached your stature and who have sort of backpacked through Asia and seen life in the raw. And your experience in Vietnam, in war-torn Vietnam, you arrive in Saigon, and what you witness. And you can go to India in a crowded train in a third-class compartment, your encounter with humanity.
Yeah.
These are the 2 things you can perhaps quickly tell our audience.
Well, these are 2 of the really formative experiences for me. In Vietnam, I just arrived, middle of the war, curiosity driving me into a lunatic enterprise of seeing what was happening in Saigon. Not exactly set up for tourism. I finally found a way of hitching a ride into the city, eventually found a hotel that I could afford, which manifestly wasn't set up for sleeping. It was squalid in the extreme, filthy sheets, cigarette butts on the floor. I came in, I was looking around thinking, what am I got myself into? When the very first thing that happened, there was a commotion in the landing outside, and a great big American GI was belting a half-naked Vietnamese girl with a broomstick down the stairs. And that just encapsulated in an instant the horror, the misery, the humiliation that is associated really with any war, between anyone, anywhere. And it made me really understand, just in a way that reading everything about the Vietnam conflict had not really brought home to me. So that was one experience. The other experience was just a completely different kind of experience, travelling around in third-class trains in India as a young student on my way to Oxford from Australia, as you say. And on one such occasion, I think it was down in the middle of India, travelling from Sanchi to Jhansi, I can't remember. And in a very, very crowded train with my cardboard suitcase and backpack and everybody on top of everyone else. And a blind beggar got into the train at one of the stations, singing to the compartment and then bringing his cup around. This is how he obviously tried to survive. I had a big clunky tape recorder with me, which I was recording the sounds of India. And unbeknown to him, I recorded him while he was singing. And as he was handing around his tin cup, I played that recording back. His first reaction was one of incredible anger. There's someone else on my patch in this train. He'd never heard his own voice before. And the passengers calmed him down, calm down. Listen, this is you. And the most wonderful beatific smile, broke out. I mean, just to watch this guy, very old man, hearing himself and recognising for the first time what it was. And that was just a magical moment, I think, of just, and the rest of the trip, I mean, he sang, we played it back, he sang, we played it back, and the spirit of 20-odd people in that carriage crowded around this guy, all experiencing this surge of common humanity. So it's a much better story to tell when you go to big diplomatic dinners than the usual story
and you have been to many that you cannot obviously count how many, but one of the things that you have done, of many things you have done in Asia, is your role in bringing the ASEAN countries together and the international community to find peace in Cambodia. So that
was a very big challenge, the Cambodia. We're talking about the late 80s. The Khmer Rouge had been pushed out by Hun Sen's Vietnam-backed administration to the margins of the country, but civil war was still waging. There were still nearly 400,000 people, refugees, displaced on the border. The country was in a condition of total misery and was incredibly divided. Internally, the political factions, communist, non-communist, all hated each other. Vietnam and the ASEAN countries at the time hated each other. The ASEANs were supporting the non-communist Sihanouk regime. The Vietnamese were supporting Hun Sen. The great powers were also lined up, the Chinese behind the Khmer Rouge, the Russians behind the Vietnamese, and the Americans behind the non-communist ASEAN. So bringing all that together, finding a way through it was the great challenge of the 1980s. And Australia, during my term as Foreign Minister, was able to take a leading role in this because we basically came up with the concept of a major role for the UN in the transitional period, an unprecedentedly central role for the UN, in which it wouldn't just do election monitoring but would actually administer the country, take over the executive responsibility. The critical dimension of this in bringing the peace that then was finally negotiated was that this role for the UN gave China a face-saving way of stepping back from support from the Khmer Rouge. You can explain the complex dynamics in many other ways, but that was the key that then created the conditions where a genuine consensual solution could be found. And we succeeded. We brought peace to Cambodia, but we didn't bring democracy and human rights, I'm afraid,
yes.
And that's another story.
And in this, you got unusual support from the American Congressman Steve Sollers.
Yes, the original idea for that central role for the US didn't come from me. It came from Steve Sollers, who's very well known around the region. He hadn't really thought through how it might be operationalized, but he had this dawn of an idea. And he told me when I met him in New York, UN meeting, that he'd been trying to flog the idea among the American political establishment, the policy community, and they'd all told him he was talking nonsense, that the UN had no business in this, it was going to be resolved in some other way, some other time. So he came to me and said, can you turn this into something? And I think we did. But one of the other factors, of course, was the fantastic support of the Indonesians. And Ali Alatas, my comrade in arms as foreign minister, we worked incredibly closely together. And I think, Australia recognised, which many countries would do well to recognise, that sometimes your biggest achievements can come from not thrusting yourself onto a central stage, but working through others. So although we did really gigantic amount of the work in thinking through and operationalising how this plan could come together, was using Ali Alatas as the chairman, the co-chair of the international conference and ASEAN's key foreign minister, that was the key to that success. And I think in terms of the current task we have in bringing together an increasingly fragmented and vociferous ASEAN, that role of Indonesia is going to be really crucial.
It is to your credit that you got Ali Alatas, to come around to be your partner after the episode involving East Timor, where your relations with Indonesia were in the pits.
Yeah, well, popular opinion in Australia was very hostile to Indonesia, and I was no enthusiast for Indonesia's role in 1975, which was really pretty disgraceful, the military occupation, the seizure of East Timor. But it was a reality which then none of us thought was capable of being changed. The later events in the late 90s came as a surprise, I think, to everybody, but that's a different story. Back in that period, the common cause that Ali Alatas and I had were to try to work together to find a solution, a workable solution, the East Timor problem, which would recognise the genuine autonomy still within an Indonesian sovereign framework, but autonomy, get the military out, get aid in, get cultural language recognition as part of the terrain, and just generally have a far more civilised approach. My friend and colleague Alatas was absolutely on board for that, and we worked very well together. What stymied it actually was because he was just on the point of persuading President Suharto that this is what had to be done. This was the pebble in the shoe of Indonesia's relationships, not only with Australia, but with the rest of the world. It was doing damage, and Indonesia had to step back from this authoritarian military role. Unfortunately, what killed it was a classic example of what can go wrong in public diplomacy. Bill Clinton, US President, in the lead up to the APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting, scheduled to be held in Bogor in Indonesia in 94, actually overtly made a big public speech in which she said Indonesia has to move on East Timor, has to grant autonomy. This is an impossible situation, it's depressing, it's debilitating. Indonesia has to act. And Suharto, who up until then had been prepared to act, just reacted very, very adversely to that extreme form of public pressure, leverage being put on him. He said, "Go to hell! I'm not going to move," and nothing happened, which is one of my great disappointments.
But also the massacre in Delhi.
Oh well, the massacre in Delhi was just a terrible shock to Alatas. I broke the news to Alatas at the time.
You were in Japan together.
We were in Japan. We were in Korea, I think, at a meeting together, and the news came in overnight, and I heard it earlier than he did, and his face just went absolutely white, which is because he knew it was indefensible. He knew that the military had once again got completely out of control, but he did assure me, and I totally believed him, that this was not a matter of a central direction exercise. This was just a rogue, excessive military behaviour of the kind that we'd so often seen. This got me into more political trouble than I think many other things did during my tenure as Foreign Minister, because I actually said in a public statement, I'm sure this was not a deliberate act of Indonesian state policy. It was a matter of the military once again careering out of control. We ought to recognise that in the way in which we mount our reaction, and absolutely condemnatory, and of course those responsible must be brought to book, but don't treat this as cause for breakdown in the Australia-Indonesia relation. Unfortunately, diplomatic and political life is not quite as subtle as that, and I was pilloried for my abominable embrace of the evil Indonesians, but that's life.
But however you might denounce you, you actually contributed much to the alphabet soup of ASEAN. You are involved in creating ARF.
Well, the ASEAN Regional Forum, which was a dialogue body on conflict issues, and I was also centrally involved in the creation of APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, both of which are, I think, important policy dialogue mechanisms which do have a continuing life. I think the ASEAN Regional Forum, the security one, has been rather disappointing in the impact that it's made, and I think its functions are now largely being subsumed into the new East Asian Forum, East Asian, I've forgotten.
East Asian Summit.
East Asian Summit, of course, yes. At which you do have both political and economic issues being addressed at leadership level. But ASEAN's still tremendously important conflict prevention vehicle, as the European Union has traditionally been, and states that constantly niggling and at war, at risk of violent conflict with each other, have learnt to live together. But ASEAN is certainly punching below its weight in terms of its collective capacity to produce, good behaviour in cases like Myanmar at the moment and so on. And ASEAN will be struggling to offer any kind of effective counterweight to China.
Yeah, this is what I'm going to come to. But before I come to ASEAN and China, I would like to hear your views on ASEAN and Chinese relations with Australia. Recently, there have been a lot of debate in Australia about, one, the inevitability of Australia's siding with China because of this deep economic cooperation and China's size, and on the other hand, the Chinese overt attempt to influence Australian public opinion, politics, is creating a lot of anger and opposition. So where do you stand on that issue?
Well, Australia is not very different from most of the other countries in the region who simultaneously are huge economic partners of China, our biggest partner, and that's the case for most of the other countries in Southeast Asia. And at the same time relying traditionally for our security on American alliance or partnership relationships or dominance in the region. And all of us want to avoid desperately a kind of zero-sum game developing in which we will have to choose between our security partners and our economic partners. We don't want that to happen. China is seen in many circles as engaged at the moment in a lot of chest beating and wing flapping and perhaps overreach. South China Sea, some of the other things it's doing, and in terms of the way in which it has been caught out trying to exercise influence through various intermediaries on Australian politicians. I don't think we should be too spooked by this. I mean, China is not behaving any differently from any other rising power. It's got the centuries of humiliation behind it. It's got decades of being treated, even while its rise was becoming obvious, as still a rule taker rather than a rule maker in the global order. I mean, as recently as the end of the Obama administration, the wonderful Obama administration, Barack Obama is saying in the context of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, we make the rules. China's not going to make the rules, we make the rules. So it's not surprising that China should be being rather more assertive in wanting to play itself into the game. And I don't think we're seeing anything in Australia or anywhere else that should alarm us to the point of wanting to breach the relationship or run back to Washington, particularly not in Washington's current mood of disengagement and quite erratic response to all these issues. I think it's perfectly capable that China will play a constructive role in the regional and the global order and will be committed and be an effective producer of global and regional public goods. I mean, look at the way it is behaving on the climate issue. Yes, there's a bit of cynical opportunism involved in moving in to fill the space that the Americans have left. Look at the way it's talking the talk on trade policy and so on. Yes, maybe a bit of cynicism there. But on the whole, if we can tap the better angels of the Chinese nature, their desire to be an active part of a cooperative global and regional community, I don't think we need to worry too much. We do have to, just one more point, we do have to push back, I think, when it gets over assertive, as it has been in the South China Sea with its occupancy of these islets and reefs and the building of effectively military installations. I don't think that is in breach of the international rule book, and I don't think we should just accept it. I think they should do the navigation operations and all the rest of it, which makes clear that this is going too far.
You said that you supported the Australian policy of freedom of navigation operations going within 12 miles of these islets or reefs. But at the same time, you also say in your book that you don't like the idea of U.S. Claiming dominance or. Well,
they're two separate issues. I mean, the responding to the Chinese overreach ought to be not just a US thing or an Australian thing, it ought to be an Indonesian thing, a Malaysian thing, a Vietnamese thing. We ought to be cooperatively engaged in that pushback because China will be all too comfortable in pushing the envelope and recreating by default those hegemonic relationships, those tributary relationships that are traditionally enjoyed with the countries of the region where everybody kowtows. I don't think China wants to push the envelope violently, but it will go just as far as it can when its comfort zone is not challenged. So that's important. But on the larger issue, I think it is time for America to recognise that China's a very, very big player globally, regionally, and that the traditional P word, primacy, predominance, preeminence, the D word, dominance, these words are just no longer an appropriate way of describing either what is possible or what is desirable. The most sensible thing I ever heard said on the US-China relationship was by Bill Clinton 2 years after he left the presidency and was in private meeting. It wasn't in a public forum, and he never ever used, though he came close to it in Yale a couple of years later, actually, at a public event, but not using these words, which to me were very graphic. What I heard Clinton say, sharing a platform with him, was there are two choices America faces in how we use this great and unrivaled military and economic power that we have. Choice number one is to use that huge military and economic power to try to stay top dog on the global bloc in perpetuity. Choice number two is to create a world in which we will be comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the global bloc. I thought that was pitch perfect. Not something that people even now feel comfortable saying in American public life, because you never want to accept that America will be anything other than unchallenged number one. But the reality is those days are over. America has to find some space. You have to look for cooperative solutions to these problems, not dominant solutions.
Well, you have got Donald Trump, who's willing to hand over Asia to the Chinese, because that's what in reality is happening by withdrawing from TPP.
Well, I don't think he knows what he's doing. He's a creature of instinct rather than policy judgment. He obviously has no real quality advice around him. He pushes one direction on trade, then another direction the next day on something else. Nobody in the region knows what the hell he's about, except that there's nothing like the same passionate commitment to those alliance relationships and nothing like the same commitment to strong, continued American engagement in the region. America first is not necessarily America
So the
engaged.
question is, if the region is so disheartened about the possibility of American support in case of any threat they face, wouldn't it be natural for them to just move towards China, saying that this is our...
Well, there are other options. I mean, America is going to stay engaged. It has to. I mean, it's economically committed. There's so much of the American heart and soul is built in. And America's not going to go away, but it's going to be one player among others. It's not going to be the sun around which that part of the world revolves. What is important is for the other countries in the region to work together cooperatively to build military working relationships, political, diplomatic relationships that do make common cause against possible Chinese overreach. I'm not talking about a containment exercise. I'm not talking about anything as vulgar or as extreme as some of the language that's going around, but the relationship that can and should, I think, be forged between India, which has interests of its own vis-a-vis China, obviously, Australia, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam. All of us have a common interest in ensuring that the peace and stability of the region is maintained. And between us, we have quite a lot of clout. We have quite a lot of
But you
power.
have in your book, you say you are not very in favor of the idea of Quad, the so-called Japan, Australia, India, US.
When the Quad idea was first formulated back in 2007, this was before we had seen the Chinese overreach in South China Sea in particular. And it was then a very obvious ideological containment, and military containment sort of operation. Australia said, no, we value our relationship with China. We don't think we need to be as overtly involved in this. And I was very, very cautious myself, and I embraced that view. As time has gone on, and even since finishing the book, now nearly a year ago, I suppose, when it went to press, I do think it is important that there be visible cooperation between all the other significant countries in the region to make it clear that we all value a rules-based international order, while we value our economic relations with China, while we don't want to in any way, quash China's ambitions, strategic ambitions, economic ambitions, Belt and Road and all the rest. We don't want to quash it. We do think China has a place in the sun and in the rule-making sun, not just the rule-taking. Sure. But nonetheless, we are not going to sit idly by and watch a steady encroachment on sovereignty sorts of issues, as the territorial sea issue is in the South China Sea, without making very clear where we collectively stand and making clear our capacity to resist that if that ever came to it.
So
I don't think it will. I don't think China is in the slightest bit interest in provoking any kind of a military confrontation with anybody about anything. Maybe India is a little bit of an exception because of the border issues with all the history. But in terms of having a full-scale war, it's the last thing Chinese leadership
some
wants.
would say that this is exactly what the Chinese don't want, a full-scale conflict, but their policy of salami slicing has got them what they have got in South China Sea. South China Sea is now virtually Chinese lake. And it has been achieved over the last decade in a slow and steady step.
But it's not a Chinese lake if Australian ships and Indonesian ships and Malaysian ships and Vietnamese ships are sailing constantly within what China would like to claim are its sovereign territorial waters, but which nobody else accepts as such. I mean,
but that's not happening. Only Australia and US.
I know, but that's why I'm saying it should happen. I mean, if you're asking me where I stand on these issues and why I think working with ASEAN and the other countries to achieve a degree of solidarity on this is very important. And that's one of the things that worries me a bit is that, I mean, a couple of ASEAN countries are wholly owned subsidiaries of China, I'm afraid.
Including the country of your friend Hun Sen.
I'm afraid Cambodia and Laos are very, very disappointing in this respect. So we've got a lot of work to do together. But I think everybody is making common cause here. And while the Chinese are pushing the envelope, I mean, I know these guys pretty well. I mean, I don't know the current regime, and maybe they've got a different worldview than the Chen Chi-chens and the others that I spent so much time with and for whom I had so much respect. But at the end of the day, I do think China naturally wants a place in the strategic universe as well as the economic universe which reflects the reality of its size, its achievements and its aspirations. And we ought to be prepared to do just that.
Well, on that optimistic note, thank you, Mr. Evans, for talking with us.
Thank you, Nayan. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.